So, Rebecca, thank you, and take it away.
Hi, good morning. And wow, I didn't know there were this many people that would sign on this early to Zoom. Thank you, Justin, and the Creative Mornings team. I'm Rebecca Cordes-Chan. I'm the Executive Director of Friends of the Rail Park. I'm relatively new to this role and to Philadelphia. My first day on the job was actually March 16th, 2020. You can all laugh about my good fortune to yourselves on mute, please. I'll just preface everything I'm about to talk about with the fact that I get to be the face of the rail park today, but really the rail park, its vision, the completed phases, et cetera, are a testament to so many different partners, individuals, and just different people in Philadelphia that have really had the vision for this project and the dedication to bring it to life. So I just feel like on the front end. Feedback. But to be honest, I racked my brain for the weeks leading up to this morning thinking about the theme of transit and travel and journeys and how I could spin this thing. And secretly, I love trains and train travel and really just wanted to talk about that for 20 minutes, but figured I should probably focus on this infrastructure project that I'm working on that will link more than 10 neighborhoods with a car-free, pedestrian, and bike pathway and public park, also known as the Rail Park. So I'm going to introduce the Rail Park, its history, and how it came to be. There are really so many touch points and themes interwoven into this project, and there easily could be a presentation on any one of them, whether that's health equity, environmental justice, historic preservation, infrastructure reuse, arts and culture. All of that is bound up in this park. And that's probably why I'm so enamored with it, and so many other people are as well. But in keeping with today's theme, I'm going to explore kind of the ethos and purpose behind the organization that I steward, Friends of the Rail Park, and how, yes, we think about the rail park as a transit project in the sense of enabling people to move from one place to another, but we're also asking more critical questions around the issues of who can travel, where, and how. How do we recognize the legacy of travel and transit bound up in the park and in Philadelphia and really everywhere that we go in this country? And how are we as stewards of the rail park intentionally designing for this connected and liberated experience? And because I like to get my way, I promise to drop plenty of train Easter eggs as I go. But with all that said, let's get to it. This is not working. Here we go in 1 second. Sorry about this. There we go. Okay, sorry. So for those of you that don't know the rail park well, it's a vision for a 3-mile continuous park and pathway reusing historic rail lines that bisect Center City, Philadelphia. So here's a quick map, and we'll go back to this throughout the presentation. It's a huge undertaking. It's, like I said, 3 miles long. It connects Fairmount Park to Center City, North Brewerytown, all the way back to Fairmount Park. These are the neighborhoods that it would eventually connect when completed. So with that in mind, I want to take things back all the way to the 1860s, actually throughout the 1880s and 1890s. We have the Industrial Revolution going on, and it's going strong, and rail lines are booming across the country, and especially in Philadelphia. So here are some archival images of what we now recognize as pieces and parts of the rail park and just our city infrastructure in general. Starting on the western side near what is today the Art Museum in Fairmount Park, or the Fairmount neighborhood, pardon me. We have this image, as you can see. I don't think my mouse is going to show here, but if you look on the left side of the image, you can actually see the Art Museum being constructed, kind of like rising from the plains there. And by 1880s, the Baldwin Locomotive Works is one of the nation's largest locomotive manufacturers, shipping to Russia, Central Europe, Australia, building nearly all of the steam locomotives, and building nearly all the steam locomotives for the Pennsylvania and Reading Railroad lines. So that's Matthias Baldwin there. This is a image of the complex. It's huge. It's occupying the better part of 8 city square blocks, running from Broad to 18th Street. There's another image looking into it. The bridge in kind of the foreground is actually still standing to this day. And then as we go further east, we begin to think about or see the elevated rail line on which the rail park sits today. It was constructed actually in 1893 by the city of Philadelphia and the Reading Railroad Company as part of a line that connected Philadelphia to Western Pennsylvania. And this elevated rail line ran through the factories and warehouses of North Philadelphia before branching out into the rest of the region. This rail line was central to Philadelphia's development, carrying newsprint to the Inquirer building. That's actually what we're looking at here. It supplies to the Reading Terminal Market, just a few blocks south and east of here, as well as coal throughout the region. And later, this rail line eventually carries commuters from the main line into Center City, Philadelphia. So Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in particular are the epicenter of industrial America at this time, easily one of the largest manufacturers and exporters, actually from the 1860s through the 1940s. And trains are making this possible. They're hauling raw materials to manufacturing sites and then finished goods back to market. And they're also transporting consumer goods and food quickly, cheaply, and over long distances. And passenger trains are carrying people at unprecedented speeds. People are using trains to commute, to shop, and even to vacation. So in just a few decades, trains at this time are enabling an explosion of urban growth, transit, and travel at unprecedented rates. So this is all an incredibly quick and also very sterile recount of the evolution of rail and transit in Philadelphia relative to the rail park. But as much as the legacy of transit in Philly and across the country is a legacy of innovation and growth, it's also one of exclusion, disruption, and destruction. So taking things back as far as the 1600s, and really I should have done this probably at the top of this presentation. If you are zooming in today from Philadelphia or anywhere else in the region, you are most likely occupying land that was stolen, quite frankly, from the Lenape people by William Penn in 1682. So that's just one legacy that we are all still living with to this day. But acknowledging that and moving forward about 200 years to the late 1880s and thinking again about this transit boom that's sweeping the country, this is a boom that's not experienced equally nor equitably. So in 1882, around the same time that the Baldwin Motor Company that I just mentioned is reaching new levels of growth, we also have the Chinese Exclusion Act and later the Geary Act, limiting immigration based on race and leading to the migration of the Chinese community into Chinatowns, including what is now Philadelphia's Chinatown. 10 years later, in 1892, we have Homer Plessy buying a railroad ticket and sitting in a train car designated for white people only. He's arrested a few blocks later, or a few blocks away. And this becomes the basis of the 1896 Supreme Court Plessy versus Ferguson ruling that upholds the 14th Amendment, which is basically legal racial discrimination through separate but equal accommodations for Black and white people. And this is a ruling that stands until 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education. So again, limiting who can travel where and how they get there. And this is a thing that we continue to or recognize and live with. So moving into the 20th century, much like the rest of the continental United States, Philly is also a site for redlining starting in the 1930s. Urban renewal in the 1960s and the federal highway or the construction of federal highways in the 1970s. These are all practices that erase neighborhood fabric and separate people from place and each other based on race and class. And in Philadelphia in particular, this is acutely present in the Vine Street Expressway, constructed in the 1970s, that essentially cuts Chinatown and many other center city neighborhoods in half. So these are kind of the bones of transit and transportation infrastructure in our country and in our city. And this legacy, both de jure and de facto, is what we inherit. And when we continue to grapple with through the stewardship of the rail park, but also as a city and as a country as a whole. So I'm gonna pick the story of the rail park back up in the 1880s when the last train was decommissioned and the line stopped running. And people begin to explore the unused tracks and their supporting infrastructure. And I think kind of the possibility and just the imagination behind the space begins to take shape. And so this is probably what you're all here and excited to look at. So there are three main parts of this unused 3-mile rail line. We start with the Viaduct. And the Viaduct is the most well-known section of the rail park. It's a north-south stretch that starts at Vine and goes north to the 900 block of Fairmount, ramping upward, eastward, and northward, and also soaring overhead. And this elevated stretch is over just over half a mile and carried passengers in and out of the Reading terminal until the mid-1980s, pardon me. And it's currently owned by Reading International, and future phases of the rail park will require working through private ownership issues and acquisition as well. So this is a drone aerial shot of the viaduct, so you can see here. Here's where it's now above street grade. And these photos admittedly are a little dated. If you were to climb up there today, it's much more overgrown. So I figured I'd show somewhat older photos so you can get an idea of the remaining infrastructure that's there. There it is crossing the street. There we go. Some more pictures. Garden station. More photos. So the next section is called, or we refer to it as the cut. So this is west of Broad, and this is where the rail line historically descended below street level. And the cut stands, like I said, just below street level and then stretches beneath North Broad, past the Inquiry Building, to all the way behind the Rodin Museum in Fairmount Park. And this line is the former freight line, which brought raw materials and finished goods in and out of Philadelphia, cutting through the Baldwin Locomotive campus back in the day. And so if you were to walk down there today, there's still areas where you can see the on and off ramps where they would kind of roll carts and the goods down into the cut and then back out. So it's just a neat relic to take a look at. So I'm gonna keep flipping through here. Got some cool photos. The Granary Building. And then the final piece of this 3-mile vision is the tunnel. So the tunnel is just to the west of the cut, just beyond and behind the Rodin Museum. It's where the line enters the tunnel, pardon me. It runs under Pennsylvania Avenue, starting at North 22nd and emerging at North 27th. And you can see from photos, there's just this beautiful brick archway and there's where it goes kind of underground there. These beautiful brick archway, ventilation shafts. There's a decent amount of natural light down there. Pardon me. And from our perspective and people who are interested in developing the park, it's a huge opportunity to host year-round programs and events. In other words, it's a gathering space that wouldn't be weather dependent. So there's a huge opportunity there. It's also a very wide and expansive space. So there's just a lot to think of in terms of like what to actually do with all that space as well. So this just about gets us up to current day. So up until this point, we're now talking about the early 2000s and even into the 2000s and 2010s. Some people see the looming structures in their neighborhoods as blight. Others see this as an opportunity inspired by projects like the Promenade Planté in Paris, as well as people have mentioned the High Line earlier, New York City. And ultimately, a cost study shows that it's cheaper to save the infrastructure, especially around phase 1, rather than tear it down. And so I am kind of toggling back and forth here a little bit, but just to give you a little more history, in 2003, a bunch of community members formed the Reading Viaduct project and began the advocacy work to remediate what is formerly known as the SEPTA Spur. We now refer to it as phase 1, as well as the Reading Viaduct into a public park. I'm just going to flip so we can look at a nicer photo here. So around 2010 or so, the Reading Viaduct the Reading Viaduct project, pardon me, begins working with the Center City District, the City of Philadelphia's Commerce Department and Department of Parks and Recreation to evaluate park options for the abandoned tracks. And this is when that study that I had referenced earlier emerges, showing that it's more economical actually to redevelop the park rather than tear that infrastructure down. Meanwhile, in 2013, the Reading Viaduct Project and Friends of the Rail Park, two at this point separate organizations, merged to become one advocacy and fundraising project known as Friends of the, or organization, pardon me, known as Friends of the Rail Park. And Friends of the Rail Park, together with the aforementioned partners, begins working jointly during design, fundraising, and construction efforts. And it's this cooperation of a dynamic group of partners that results in phase 1 of the rail park. So phase 1, which is led by Center City District, as well as Studio Brian Haynes. I think I saw Brian on the call or on the list of attendees. Hey, Brian. And urban engineers work together, and construction begins in 2016. In June of 2018, phase 1 of the rail park opens to the public. Again, this is like a very simplified version of what happened. There was plenty of blood, sweat, and tears that went into that. But for the purposes of a Creative Mornings talk, we're gonna speed right along. So today, the rail park is maintained by Philadelphia Parks and Recreation. They're also the leaseholders of the park. SEPTA still technically owns the land the park sits on. And programming, community engagement, and some maintenance support is also led by Friends of the Rail Park, again with support from Center City District. It was certainly not a perfect process, but phase 1 certainly serves as proof of concept for the full 3-mile vision. So here are some more photos. It's really fun to see. So this is kind of the schematic aerial this way. And this, again, they're older photos. The park has certainly grown in quite, or like the foliage has grown in quite a bit. But I think it's interesting to show some of the older photos again, so that you get an idea of kind of the infrastructure that the park is sitting on. So here we're a little more grown in here. I like having photos that have people in them. It's important since we build these things for people after all. There's our swings, more swings. And I'm actually gonna sit here for a second. So the last thing I'm gonna talk about before I wrap up is actually my organization, Friends of the Rail Park. And our mission is to serve as a city's partner in activating and maintaining phase 1, as well as stewarding the vision and fundraising for bringing future phases of the park to life. We balance the goals of leading the charge to develop future phases of the park into this kind of world-class, nothing like you've ever seen before, awesome 3-mile vision for the park, while also advocating for comprehensive and equitable community development, ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to not only access the park and its future phases, but to also equitably access the benefits of the investment that goes into future phases of the park. We know from projects like the High Line and there's several others across the country that these projects really have the potential to displace and to have negative impacts on communities. So we, as Friends of the Rail Park, are trying to be very forward thinking and proactive about how we mitigate those potential impacts. And as we balance these at times competing goals, because we know we must purposefully and intentionally correct the systems and policies and legacies that I mentioned earlier, we go out of our way to create programming that is intentionally inclusive, whether that's offering bilingual opportunities or culturally responsive programming. We really want to roll out the welcome mat for the communities, not only surrounding phase 1 of the rail park, thinking about Chinatown North and Callow Hill, but again, the full 3-mile vision and the 10+ neighborhoods that the park touches. So these are the values that guide our work, form and function. We create innovative, functional, and beautiful public space, and this should say programming as well. We're guided by the value of accessibility. We believe in designing for the most vulnerable, and when we do that, it ultimately benefits us all. Cultural integrity, this is a big one. We build from existing assets, preserving local culture and values. Community-oriented collaboration. We work with community members and stakeholders to determine our shared future. Inclusion, this is a really important one, especially in 2020. We center inclusion, equity, and justice in our work. And finally, measurable impact. We are committed to a positive and measurable impact in the communities we serve, and that it's really important to actually, the measuring piece is the important part about this. So how do we know that we're actually being successful? None of these values are mutually exclusive, but for the purposes of this discussion, I wanted to talk about and just really highlight this idea of accessibility. And what I think about is the curb cut effect. So the kind of idea behind the curb cut effect, which was coined by PolicyLink's Angela Glover Blackwell, is the idea that designing for the most vulnerable amongst us ultimately benefits us all. So if you've ever thought about a curb cut actually on the street, it's basically a ramp designed for ADA compliance. People in wheelchairs can get up onto the sidewalk. But what able-bodied person in the audience has ever been on roller skates or a bike or maybe pushing a stroller and felt that instant relief as you hit that curb cut and you roll smoothly into the street or up onto the sidewalk instead of falling out onto the edge? So that's an example of a physical design intervention that, again, designed for a vulnerable person or a vulnerable population, but ultimately benefits everyone. So that's the idea behind the curb cut effect. And what I really want to do, and what Friends of the Rail Park is really striving to do, is to make sure that this concept, this ethos, this idea is applied to everything that we do as the rail park, from the design to programming to even policies that we advocate for. Here are just a few more photos. This is from a Lunar New Year festival that we had. Let's see, actually, I think I should probably talk a little bit more even about, or continue talking about Friends of the Rail Park. So just a little bit more about us. We're a small but mighty organization. We're a staff of 2 with an awesome board. Shout out to my colleague Ava Schwemmler, as well as Sunanda Ghosh, who I think I saw also on this call. And our work is heavily dependent on partnership with both the city, but also Center City District Development Corporation, and a whole slew of other partners from the arts, culture, private sector, and community development space. Our first season of programming pre-COVID, FRP engaged almost 8,000 people through more than 50 events, everything from that Lunar New Year festival I showed a photo of just a few moments ago, to yoga, to astronomy nights, plant swaps, walking tours, game nights, all of this is done with our partners, in particular Asian Arts Initiative, PCDC, and Callow Hill Neighborhood Association. But again, we're trying to really roll out the welcome mat at first through programming, because we have this space through phase 1. But again, thinking about how do we use programming and the engagement and the kind of human interaction that we build through that to really get a sense of what people want to see in future phases of the park. So I think I'm actually at about time here. And as I wrap up, I just want to, tie this back to kind of this idea of like transit and travel. And when I think about my life prior to the rail park, prior to the pandemic, I traveled a lot for work. And my transit was always focused on getting from point A to point B as efficiently and as effectively, and not really taking into account, my surroundings, but how do I get there as quickly as possible? And 2020 for me has really been a reality check in terms of just really seeing how fragile everything is, and how ephemeral, and how I took a lot of that travel for granted. But in a way, this has always been the case. The world is full of nuance, it's full of complexity, and that we are seeing that so much this year. But to me, I think that I also had this realization when I was creating this presentation that that's not a reason to give up on new journeys or, dreams of building a giant project like the rail park. And in fact, if anything, this is a reason to double down on the things that we love, to go out into the world and to invest in the things that we believe in, from 6 feet apart, of course. So with that, I'm gonna end here. The only other thing I'll say is that today is the last day to register to vote in Philadelphia. And we are actually hosting a Get Out the Vote campaign, or a voter registration campaign this evening from 5 to 7 at the rail park. So please come visit us if you need to get registered. And with that, I'm gonna pause there. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think that was a fabulous plug for everyone to remember to vote, if it's either in person, socially distant, if it's registering to get your ballot, or your mail-in ballot, or voting early in Philadelphia. Rebecca, I think that was a phenomenal history lesson. I personally love when there's a nod to the historical aspects of the intersection of racism and anything. I think that set the tone for me, and I said, I know where we're going and I know how we're going to talk about it. So thank you.